Ayatollah Ali Al-Sistani, revered by many as one of the most important scholars in the Muslim world, imitated by millions in the 12 Shia community today. His most recent meeting with the Pope highlights his importance both internationally as well as nationally. A man who's seen a world war, revolutions, terrorism, and transitions from one government to another. But who exactly is this man? What influences his worldview? For the first time ever, join me in this documentary, as I will go on a journey, both literal and metaphorical, to explore the social, political, and theological worldview of one of the most important figures in the 21st century. Ayatollah Al-Sistani was born on the 4th of August 1930 in the city of Mashhad, the second most populous city in Iran, the capital of the Khorasan province. The city of Mashhad occupies a prominent position in the lives of many Muslims in the world today, especially those in the 12 Shia community. The city itself, in the opinion of some, derives its name because it is the resting place of the great-grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family, known as Ali, the son of Musa al-Rida. Ali, the son of Musa al-Rida, is seen as the 8th of the 12 Imams of the 12 theology, and he passed away in the city of Mashhad. Therefore, the city becomes a center of pilgrimage. There are many, in showing their love and their reverence for the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who undertake the journey to go and visit the great-grandchildren of the Prophet. There are some who reside there, and indeed, the city itself has been the home to some of the greatest scholars, mystics, and poets. Of those scholars is a scholar who is an ancestor of Ayatollah Al-Sistani, the revered scholar Muhammad Baqir Al-Husseini Al-Astarabadi, known as Mir Damad, regarded by many as one of the greatest scholars in the history of the religion of Islam and one of its greatest philosophers. And where better to begin the journey in gaining knowledge, wisdom, spirituality than in the vicinity of one of the most revered personalities in the history of the religion of Islam, Imam Ali ibn Musa al-Rida alayhi salam. Imam Ali ibn Musa al-Rida alayhi salam is revered by all schools in the religion of Islam. Indeed, there are many who have taken their traditions, and his contemporary scholars and peers would always narrate the importance of understanding his knowledge, his wisdom, as well as his spirituality. Many of them would revere him, and many of them would recognize his influence. The young Sayyid Ali Sistani begins a journey of knowledge, the same journey that his great-grandfather, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family, had wanted to be undertaken by the Muslim community, when he would say lines such as "seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave." And Mashhad, in those early years of the life of Ayatollah Al-Sistani, had some of the greatest scholars that the Islamic seminary has ever produced, the likes of Sheikh Mehdi Ashtiyani, Mirza Hashim Al-Qazwini, Ayatollah Sheikh Mehdi Al-Asfahani, all have a profound effect on Sayyid Ali Sistani's life. He enters the Islamic seminary. The Quran is of the utmost importance to him in his life. The traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the traditions of his family play a pivotal role in those early years. At the same time, alongside seeking to gain knowledge, the young Ali Sistani witnesses the governance of the Pahlavi monarchy. Indeed, in his childhood, Ayatollah Sistani sees the implementation of the banning of the wearing of the veil in Iran, and sees over 1,000 people die for standing up against such a law. Therefore, one may argue that his period living in Mashhad is a period not only in which he studies the Quran and studies Islamic theology, but he also sees the dangers of tensions within the Muslim community. And he also sees that sometimes difference of opinion can lead to major clashes that lead to deaths. And hence one may argue that his time in Mashhad has a profound effect on him in his later years, when he sees clashes between people of the same religion who have differences of opinion with one another. And so from a young age, at the age of 5, you find that Ayatollah Sistani begins what proves to be one of the most illustrious careers of all jurists in the 21st century. If Mashhad was known as the first religious city of Iran, then Qom is a close second. Qom is the 7th largest city in Iran and has a history very much related to the 12 Shia community. The Shia of the Ash'ari tribe who had come to Qom had a profound influence on the Shia community. But you find at the same time the sister of Ali, son of Musa al-Rida, known as Fatima al-Ma'suma, is an inspiration for many to come to visit Qom, but also to reside, but also to study. And many of the greats of Shia history were those who were either scholars in Qom or teachers in the seminary. The likes of Sheikh al-Saduq, one of the most renowned figures in Shia history, was a scholar of Qom.
The holy city of Qom. If the shrine of Imam al-Rada, peace be upon him, has an effect on Ayatollah Al-Sistani, then the shrine of his sister directly behind me, السيد Ma'suma, has an effect on the life of Ayatollah Al-Sistani when he moves from Mashhad to Qom. Qom until today is seen as the center of learning for many Shia in the world. And Ayatollah Al-Sistani in his teenage years comes to Qom for a few years to continue his studies. It's in this period in Qom that the rector of the seminary is known as Ayatollah Husseini Al-Burjurdi, one of the greatest scholars in Shia history, and a man of great influence, and who has a profound effect on the life of Ayatollah Al-Sistani. At the same time, a few of the lessons taken by Ayatollah Al-Sistani are under the guidance of Ayatollah Al-Khomeini.
Professor Rizvi, can you give us an overview of the development of religious authority in 12th Shia theology?
In the period of the Imams, authority was very clear. It lay with the Imams and lay with those who they had appointed directly as their representatives. Of course, once the 12th Imam, the Mahdi, goes into occultation, the situation becomes a bit more obscured. And that period in the history of the faith is known as the period of confusion or hayra. Now, what seems to then have developed in that period is that you also have the growth of a class of individuals who emerges who are well-versed and learned in the hadith of the Imams, and increasingly are well-versed in theological argumentation. So a class of ulama, as we would have it, emerge. This didn't actually happen out of nothing. There were already people that the Imams had trained themselves and who had acted as defenders of the faith even in the time of the Imams, whether that was in Medina or whether it was in Iraq or other places. They don't claim to have authority, but they claim that as a general body, they have a role in the absence of the Imam to continue to defend the faith and to represent the community and to act in the interest of the community. And so in that sense, they developed this idea that they had a delegated sort of authority.
There are different terms which are closely associated with the term alim or ulama, scholar or scholars. You sometimes hear the term allama or hujjat al-Islam. And most famously, Ayatollah Al-Sistani. Can you give us an overview of the history and development of these terms?
So Ayatollah is certainly, like many of these modern titles, is something which seems to have emerged in the 19th and arguably the 20th century. There were different ways of honoring people in the past. Of course, calling someone Allama meant they were the most learned. And those sorts of honorific titles were given to people who were widely recognized for their piety, but also widely recognized for their scholarship. And their recognition of scholarship came through the works they wrote, and also, of course, significantly from their teaching. The word Ayatollah, I think, in the modern period, in the 20th century in particular, becomes associated with someone who is learned in the law, in jurisprudence, who produces, for example, a risala that someone follows, whose fatwa they follow. So basically, in today's language, we would describe that person as a marja, right? Someone who is a source of emulation, source of authoritative rulings on how you live your life.
Many normally would associate Ayatollah Al-Sistani with Mashhad or Najaf. But under the auspicious guidance of Ayatollah Al-Burjurdi, you found that Qom continued to flourish. And Ayatollah Al-Sistani found that Qom remained of the utmost importance in his heart.
There is no doubt that the pinnacle of studies in the life of any Shi'i theologian is the city of Najaf. Having studied in Mashhad, migrated to Qom, Ayatollah Sistani then migrates to Najaf. And Najaf becomes a home. Najaf is his life. Najaf is where he will witness some of his greatest moments, but also some of his most difficult. Many people do not realize that Ayatollah Al-Sistani had to see government after government. He sees Abdul Karim Qasim, Abdul Salam Arif, the Ba'ath regime, the rise of communism, the fall of communism. And therefore, intellectual conversations prove to be of the utmost importance in his worldview. While in Najaf, many may study 3 stages in order that they reach the pinnacle of being a scholar in the fields of jurisprudence and theology, Ayatollah Sistani seeks to incorporate an understanding of the world that surrounds him. He witnesses that there are tensions, sectarian tensions, in parts of North Africa and in parts of the Middle East. Revolutions are taking place. He witnesses religious figures who are speaking out against one another, hate that is spreading. Therefore, his life in Najaf is not just a life where he is in the seminary. Rather, at the same time, he keeps up to date with the affairs that surround him. The scholars that surround him, of course, have a profound effect on his life. The likes of Sheikh Hussein Al-Hilli, Ayatollah Al-Khoi, Ayatollah Muhsin Al-Hakim. Each and every one of these scholars has a profound effect on the worldview of Ayatollah Al-Sistani. Trials and tribulations are many. He witnesses scholars around him who are executed, who are banished, who are assassinated. He witnesses scholars around him who are constantly under surveillance. Some who return home, some who don't. But this has an effect on making him stronger. And also, in his vision that one day scholars of different sects and of different religions can come together in dialogue, be it intra-faith or interfaith. Just how important is Najaf, the seminary of Najaf, in relation to knowledge in the Shia world?
Najaf, and more generally Iraq, has actually since the time of the Imams been the center of gravity of the Shia community. The fact that a number of the Imams are buried in Iraq is very significant. And so we've had, because of that center of gravity, because of the shrines in particular, you had circles of learning developing around that. And those circles of learning have then become established as institutions, seminaries, hawzat, ilmiya as they're known, hawza. And that's really where authority is expressed and articulated, and from which authority is disseminated.
The city of Najaf, one of the holiest sites in the religion of Islam. A city that predates the religion of Islam, but a city which everyone flocks to. For one reason, the final resting place and the shrine of the man buried behind me, the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family, Imam Ali, peace be upon him. Imam Ali, as we all know, was a man who gave his whole life to the religion of Islam. Muslims of all different schools and denominations revere the man. The man recognized as being the one who was a backbone to the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, at all times. And a man who lived in Mecca, lived in Medina, but also lived 6 miles away from here, in the holy city of Kufa. But his final resting place became a center for the hearts of many Muslims around the world, and especially of the Shia community. You look around me and you see the reason why the likes of Ayatollah Al-Sistani not only wanted to come here, but to study here, because they felt that they were next to the man who embodied knowledge, embodied wisdom, and the man who the Prophet referred to when he said, "I am the city of knowledge, and Ali is its gate."
Migration is part and parcel of the life of many of the great scholars, and one may argue was part and parcel of the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his family. And migration plays a major role in the life of Ayatollah Sistani. He's born in Mashhad, studies in Mashhad, moves to Qom, studies in Qom, and then migrates to Najaf. Why the migration from these different centers of learning?
We know that people have been traveling to Najaf to seek knowledge, to be trained, to sit with the leading scholars of their time for centuries. This has been going on for a very long time. And at the very least, one would say since the 15th century, 16th century, Najaf has been a very major center of learning. Before that, Hilla, which is not very far, was quite important. But people used to go back and forth. So even when people talk about Hilla being the important place, they would probably spend half the week in Najaf anyway. So we know that Allama Hilli, etc., used to often go and write some other works in Najaf. And that's why from an early period, even the texts that these figures wrote were then kept in the library of the shrine in Najaf. In more recent times, certainly from the Safavid period onwards, and especially after the fall of the Safavids in the 18th century, there wasn't an obvious center of learning outside of Iraq. And so Najaf becomes even more significant. So when you have figures who were, say, in South Asia, in Central Asia, in Iran, in the Arab lands, etc., they tended to go to Najaf because it was somewhere which was safe. It was a safe and secure and authoritative Shia space.
Imam Ali is known around the Muslim world, revered in many circles, in the Shi'i school revered as the first of the leaders in succession to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his family, known as the Imams. And in the non-Shi'i schools within the religion of Islam, he is seen as the forthrightly guided caliph. And hence you find that many people from around the world, many pilgrims, who come towards the city of Najaf with one intention, and that is to get close to knowledge and to get close to those who bore knowledge. He is known as the gate to the city of knowledge, and hence you found that for the past 1,000 years, there have been many scholars who have come from far and wide to be the neighbors, as well as the recipients of knowledge in what is known as the Hawza Ilmiya. Al-Hawza Al-Ilmiya is known as literally the enclosed circle of knowledge, an enclosed space of knowledge where knowledge is guarded, where people are able to study different subjects. Subjects such as Arabic grammar, but also subjects related to the Quran, as well as subjects related to the study of hadith, history, as well as jurisprudence. Different sciences such as philosophy and ethics have been studied for the past 1,000 years. One may argue that all credit for Najaf being the center of knowledge is to be given towards a particular personality known as Sheikh al-Tusi. Sheikh al-Tusi, because of strife of a sectarian nature in Baghdad, had to leave and migrate to Najaf. His migration and Ayatollah Al-Sistani's migration is similar in the sense that Ayatollah Al-Sistani moves from Mashhad towards Qom, towards Najaf. Sheikh al-Tusi had to leave Baghdad and he came to Najaf. And while one may argue that Najaf was not the locus of Shi'i learning for the past 1,000 years, but certainly in the past few hundred years, some of the most renowned scholars are those who graduated from Najaf. And that's why when Ayatollah Al-Khou'i came here, Ayatollah Al-Sistani and others came here to gain their knowledge within the vicinity of this wonderful shrine where you see many around us seeking both knowledge as well as spirituality. Like others, you found that Ayatollah Al-Sistani found his home in Najaf. And indeed, Najaf would provide you with a structure in which you were able to gain your knowledge. Preliminary, intermediate, and then advanced. His advanced studies were in Najaf. His advanced learning was in Najaf. A Socratic method, inviting students to share their opinions. You found that the teachers would be able to move from one topic to another. 1 minute talking about law, the next minute Arabic grammar, the next minute the narrations of the Prophet Muhammad and his family, and then from then on the philosophy behind the jurisprudential verdicts. He, at the tender age of 31, was recognized as one of the highest of the jurists in his circles. But out of respect, courtesy, etiquette in Najaf, one recognizes that if their teachers are still alive, they don't necessarily put forward all their opinions to the public. He had seen a number of his teachers pass away. Ayatollah Muhsin al-Hakim. He had seen Sheikh Hussein al-Hilli pass away. But he continued to revere Ayatollah al-Khou'i. At the same time, you found that Ayatollah al-Sistani recognized that it was not just enough for a person to be a top jurist. How was his private life? Was he someone who looked after his family? Was he someone who sought to live a luxurious life? Or someone who sought to be altruistic and look out for others? There are stories attributed to him and his family that they only had one rug in the house. And when his friend was getting married, he gave that rug as a gift. But it wasn't like his wife herself, the granddaughter of an illustrious scholar, the famous scholar known as the Shirazi of Samarra, who was involved in the famous tobacco uprising. She herself was the backbone to Ayatollah Al-Sistani. And while many mention Ayatollah Al-Sistani's greatness, there is very little attention that is paid to the lady who in all this period remained alongside him. There are times when a person loves being in Najaf because they can be next to the shrine of the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon his family. There are others when a person sees political upheavals and assassinations and executions, and it means you have to remain firm, steadfast, patient. And many do not realize that in 1991, with the Gulf War, Ayatollah Al-Sistani was tortured in a hotel on the outskirts of Najaf known as As-Salam Hotel. And then he was taken to detention camp after detention camp. Many of us see Ayatollah Al-Sistani and we see his meeting with the likes of the Pope, and we see different people come and visit him. But many of us don't realize that there are wounds, both physical and emotional, in his life. Emotional wounds of having lost his contemporaries, his peers, those who he used to sit with and smile and discuss and analyze and examine different texts with. But on the physical level as well, in 1991, it took its toll. He was tortured, one may argue, in the way that his great-grandfather, Imam Ali ibn al-Hussein Zain al-Abidin, peace be upon him, was tortured on the plains and after the plains of Karbala on the journey towards Sham.
In this exclusive interview, I discussed with someone who was in prison with Ayatollah Al-Sistani in 1991. Sayyid Ali Khalkhali, Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Can you please tell us more about that period in prison with Ayatollah Al-Sistani and other scholars in 1991 at the time of the uprising?
بدايات رمضان كان بعد سقوط النجف بيد الجيش العراقي. احنا بعد رجعنا للبيوت وفي الخفاء كنا مدة من الزمن. بعدين طرق الباب، شفنا الجيش جايين علينا واخذونا عشوائيا. اخذوا والدي آية الله السيد محمد تقي الخلخالي، اني والشهيد سيد امين الخلخالي. وبعدين التحقوا بنا آية الله العظمى السيد علي السيستاني، ونجلاه آية الله السيد محمد رضا، السيد محمد باقر، آية الله العظمى مرزا علي الغروي الشهيد، آية الله العظمى الشيخ مرتضى البرجردي الشهيد، وسماحة السيد عبد الهادي الشيرازي، آية الله السيد عبد الهادي الشيرازي، والسيد مهدي الشيرازي، وكثيرون كانوا معنا. وعددنا كان 17 من الإيرانيين المقيمين في النجف الأشرف. أول مكان استوقفونا هو فندق السلام المحيط نواحي النجف. ربطوا أيدينا وسألوا الأسماء، بدأوا من آية الله العظمى السيد علي السيستاني. وتدرون في العراق المرسوم الاسم الثلاثي، فالسيد سماحته قال أنا اسمي علي محمد باقر علي الحسيني السيستاني. فهذول تخيل لهم أنه من قرايب سيد محمد باقر الحكيم، فقاموا بضرب السيد سماحته، فبحيث أنه وصل إلى حالة الموت. وهناك سيد محمد رضا السيستاني استنجد بأشخاص، قال أنه والدي مريض وحالته مو مسامحة والآن جاي يموت على شرف الموت. فأجلسوا السيد بحالة سيئة كانت كلش، وإحنا وايد تأثرنا. يعني ضربونا بس أما سماحة السيد خب كبر سنه والقسها واللي تعاملوا به. بعدين إلى مدة بقينا هناك في فندق السلام. بعدين نقلونا إلى مكان ثاني، ما ندري احنا بالسيارات، ما ندري يعني ما نقدر نشوف الشوارع. انزلونا هناك، شفنا واحد هواي قاسي ويانا، يعني في الشكل قال اليوم اذبحكم كلكم، لان اخويا قتلوه في كربلاء. وتوجه الى آية الله العظمى السيد السيستاني بالسب اول شيء، ولكن بحكمة السيد وهدوءه، هذول كانوا عبالهم احنا مرتبطين بإيران بالنظام، يعني بحكومة إيرانية. ولكن السيد يعني بهدوء قال لهم احنا اصلا ما عندي ارتباط ويا إيران، لا رسالة لا كتاب لا شيء. إخواننا قرايبنا في إيران، أما مدة من وصلنا إلى العراق ماكو ارتباط. إحنا طلبة علم جايين هنا ندرس الحوزة، وهذا هدأ بحيث أنه جاب لنا فطور معون تمر في شيء كان هناك. بقينا هناك في الليل في غرفة كان يعني 3 في 2، في عددنا كان 35 غير سجناء جابوا ويانا. يعني بالليل بدأوا التحقيق فردا فردا. فأول من أخذوا آية الله العظمى السيد السيستاني أخذوه. في مدة ساعة ونص السيد رجع. احنا ما نقدر نتكلم لأن كانوا حراس. أما آية الله العظمى الشهيد البرجدي سأل السيد قال شلون كان؟ قال كلش صعب، الأسئلة كانت صعبة، ما ندري شنو الأسئلة الجاية. بقينا الليل هناك إلى يوم الصباح. يوم الثاني أخذونا هم باللوري، ما ندري 4-5 ساعات بالسيارة. انزلنا هناك، من نزلنا شفنا المكان متغير. افتهمنا احنا ببغداد، بس يعني في القرائن افتهمنا احنا مو طلعنا من كربلاء. وهذا هناك السب بدأ على الزهراء عليه السلام، على أمير المؤمنين. سب في السب يعني سب كلش مفجع، يعني احنا في حالة انهارنا به. أما السيد كان يأشر أنه لا تجاوبوا أبدا، أي واحد لا يجاوب. يعني افتهمنا ذولا يدرون ينرفزونا أو يطلعون جوابنا، هذا احنا السعكون. هناك دخلونا في قاعة كبيرة واستراحنا شوف ساعة ساعتين. السيد أمين الشهيد سيد أمين الخلخالي بدأ بتعريف آية الله العظمى السيستاني للجنود والحرس أنه هذا نائب الإمام الخوئي ومن العلماء الأوائل في النجف الأشرف. فبدأوا شوية يتعاطفون ويانا إلى مدة وجيزة. بعد المدة الوجيزة جابوا لنا أكل أما شنو ويا الجنود البقية. شفنا هناك أكو سجناء يعدون لل10 بأكل أما السيد ما قدر. يعني إحنا 1 2 3 4 5 إلى 10 كون توخر عن الأكل، وإلا يضربوك ضرب. إحنا الشباب قدرنا شو، أما هذول الكبار ما يقدرون خب الحركة. وهذا طلبوا من السيد آية الله العظمى السيد السيستاني لقاء في التلفزيون. فبدأ النقاشات، احنا كنا نشوف يروحون يجون وقالوا انه في اللقاء التلفزيون كون السيد يشير الى ايران، انه هذا الغوغاء كما يدعون الانتفاضة كان عوامله من الحكومة الإيرانية. السيد قبل أن يجي للتلفزيون يقول أما بشرطين، هذا الشرطين كلش مهم، يعني يدل على حكمة السيد سماحته. قال شرطين، أولا اسم إيران احنا باللقاء منش أبدا، والشرط الثاني أنه تعطونا رسالة من أمن بغداد إلى الأمن النجف، هذول ال17 اللي أجوا خلص تحقيقهم، بعد ما عندهم شيء لا ارتباط بالانتفاضة وصفون حساب. هم قالوا ليش اسم إيران متجيبون؟ السيد قال احنا عندنا قرايبنا بإيران ومرتبطين عوائلنا ذول خب تحت شدة إذا نجيب إيران اسم إيران، وهذا قبلوا بالشرطين. فأخذوا السيد ما ندري ساعات عديدة، وبعدين رجع السيد وبقينا في الليل هناك. صباحا خلونا في سيارة، بعدين التحقوا بينا آية الله العظمى السيد محمد كلنتر، وآية الله العظمى السيد محمد الصدر، وسماحة حجة الشيخ محمد الجواهري، والسيد مقتدى الصدر. أعتقد إخوانهم كانوا، أنا ما متأكد، أجوا ويانا التحقوا بينا لأن ذولا هم كان ماخذيهم من قبل. رجعنا إلى النجف، وجعنا النجف كان وقت غروب، خلونا بالسيارة، قالوا ممنوع التجوال إلى الصباح، لا أكل لا نقدر نعوف الباص، قالوا إنها ممنوع التجوال أيام الأول انتفاضة إلى الصباح. إلى يوم الثاني أجوا أمن النجف قرأوا الرسالة ورجعونا للبيت. أما هذه الرسالة أنقذتنا من الموت.
You know, what did you notice about Ayatollah Sistani in the prison? So say you were going through the night, how was his character?
هواية هدوء، يعني قلة الكلام ودلالة الكلام. من يتكلم كان يصبرنا، كان كلامه قليل، وما أصلا هلقد أذوه، هلقد كانوا ضربونا في الأول، أبدا لا يشكو. سبحان الله، لا يشكو، وحكمة عنده، كان حكمة. يعني هذا الشرطين احنا كنا في سجن، يعني إعدامات، ولا واحد يدري بينا، وأجب باله إنه سماحة السيد يطلب من عندنا، أنقذنا حقيقة. إحنا 17 أنقذنا من الموت.
A central part of Ayatollah Al-Sistani's development in terms of his knowledge and his leadership is Jami' al-Khadra behind me. This place played a particularly important role in the life of his teacher, Ayatollah Al-Khou'i. Ayatollah Al-Khou'i wanted this place to be a center of learning in the vicinity of the resting place of Imam Ali, peace be upon him. Ayatollah Al-Khou'i had asked in the mid-60s that this place was to be reconstructed. It's known as Jami' al-Khadra, and there are different reasons as to why it may be called Khadra. One opinion is in reference to the location. This is a Hadra, and therefore some said that originally it was known as Jami' al-Hadra or Majr al-Hadra, and later became known as Majr al-Khadra. Others say no, Khadra could refer to those who used to sell vegetables in the markets around here. But what it became most famous for was the production and the graduation of some of the most renowned scholars in the history of the religion of Islam. Many would do preliminary studies in Najaf, intermediary, and if you wanted to see the advanced lessons, you would come here. But you wouldn't just come here to learn. Ayatollah Al-Khou'i would not only teach here, but he would also lead prayers. After him, Sayyid Nasrallah Al-Mustanbit. After him, Ayatollah Al-Sistani. And Ayatollah Al-Khou'i had always insisted that there needs to be someone here who teaches, but at the same time, that spiritual lesson that one always learns from congregation in every walk of life, but especially in prayer, has to continue. And the Ba'ath regime realized that this particular location was producing some of the greatest scholars, and scholars who may speak out, scholars who had the knowledge, scholars who had wisdom. And that's why Jami' al-Khadra behind me was closed for a certain period of time. If you were to ask the question, which man made sure that it was reconstructed but also opened again, it was Ayatollah Al-Sistani. It was part of his learning, part of his leadership, and then he wanted to make it an integral part of Islamic history.
The Ba'athist regime, Saddam Hussein, orders the execution of many prominent scholars in Najaf, contemporaries of Ayatollah Sistani, those who were closely associated with him, those who he would have studied with, alongside, and benefited from. How does this impact Ayatollah Sistani psychologically?
I think it affects him and it affects a number of others as well. I mean, of course, it affects Sayyid Khou'i. You know, even the Ba'ath regime recognized that he was preeminent. And so they had to think about how they engaged with him and with his circle, of which, of course, Sayyid Sistani was a very important member of that circle. Now, I think what then happens is that one has to make calculations about what is in the best interest of the community and what is in the best of interests of keeping alive the vibrancy of the center of gravity, which is in Najaf. And if that involves basically saying a bit less on public issues and keeping the core going, keeping your teaching going, keeping your wider advice to the global community going, then so be it. And some people will take a more active approach, and some people will take an approach which says that the activity has to be geared towards the community itself, right? Now, of course, those who then did go forward and were persecuted and were executed, it's not to say that what they did was wrong. They had a different opinion about what was the best thing for the community. And ultimately, their sacrifices have been very significant because their sacrifices have meant that the community has persisted. I think the wider duty and obligation to the community does mean that sometimes you step back and sometimes you step forward. And even after 2003, we've seen that with Sayyid Sistani. That at times he's been much more vocal, and at times he's been a bit less vocal. And it's about the sorts of calculations you have to make.
I will not allow for people to say that Shaykh al-Tusi built Najaf and Ayatollah al-Khou'i destroyed it. Ayatollah al-Khou'i's famous words, where he sought to emphasize the importance of maintaining the prestige and the status of Najaf as was built and established by Shaykh al-Tusi. Ayatollah al-Khou'i saw much trial and tribulation, and Ayatollah al-Sistani would have witnessed this under his great teacher. Ayatollah al-Sistani had great reverence for Ayatollah al-Khou'i. He had reverence for his asceticism, but he also had reverence for the fact that Ayatollah al-Khou'i tried his hardest to remain wise in the most difficult of political situations. Let's not forget that some of those who had studied under Ayatollah al-Khou'i were forced to leave. The likes of Ayatollah al-Rawhani being a prime example, who had to leave. Mirza Jawad Tabrizi had to leave. Then you had others who were coerced into certain difficult moments which led ultimately to their deaths in 1991. One may argue that some of the greatest scholars that the religion of Islam had ever seen, especially in Shi'i thought, were executed for a crime they did not commit, were innocent. Indeed, the likes of Ayatollah Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, may Allah bless his soul, being amongst a number of scholars who were executed, not just in the 80s, but also in the 90s. This no doubt would have had a profound effect on Ayatollah al-Khou'i and had a profound effect on his health. Ayatollah al-Khou'i died in 1992, and it was Ayatollah al-Sistani who had the huge honor of leading his funeral prayer. One may argue symbolic of the status of Ayatollah al-Sistani at that time and forever. Let's not forget the grenade attacks that Ayatollah al-Khou'i had to endure in his own lifetime, and seeing many of his students executed. This has a profound effect on Ayatollah al-Sistani. You find that what he had seen of sectarian strife in the previous 30 years would have an effect on his outlook on the world. Could we live in Iraq where, for example, you had Shia, non-Shia alike, people of different religions, Christians, people of the Jewish faith, all living together as Iraqi citizens, rather than fighting each other, rather than killing each other, but everybody living, as the man himself said, who's buried in this holy shrine, you either live as brothers in faith or as equals in humanity.
Ayatollah al-Sistani wants to make sure that he'll remain in Iraq, even if everybody else is banished or forced to leave, or left because of dangers and trials and tribulations. The 1991 Gulf War, he witnesses executions, assassinations, and then he witnesses the passing away of his mentor, his leader, his great teacher, Ayatollah al-Khou'i. It's Ayatollah al-Sistani who leads the funeral prayer. This is of the utmost importance for two reasons. On the one level, the piety is attested to at this moment. There are other great scholars who are around. But when you lead the funeral prayer of a grand scholar like Ayatollah al-Khou'i, then this is the symbol of your piety. At the same time, it's symbolic because of its relationship to knowledge. The most knowledgeable one would normally be the one who leads the funeral prayer of a grand Ayatollah. From that moment onwards, while there were other great scholars such as Sayyid Abdul Ali al-Sabzawari and Sayyid Muhammad Rada al-Gulpaigani, Ayatollah al-Sistani assumes the helm as the rector of the seminary of Najaf. The renowned Ayatollah al-Khou'i passes away in 1992. Can you tell us more about the transition phase and how Ayatollah Sistani goes on to lead the Muslim community, the 12 Shia community at large.
You know, at times in history, there's been one figure who has been extremely prominent and above everyone else. But it's never been the case that at one time in the world there's only been one figure who we sometimes, think is the representative of the Imam. That's just not the way it works. So even when Sayyid Khoi was there, yes, he was extremely significant and very prominent in Najaf, but there were other people in Najaf, some of whom were killed before him, some of whom were killed after him, or who died before him, after him. There were a number of other figures in Iran and other places as well. I think the issue was, for someone like Sayyid Sistani to emerge, the issue was, how is the authority of Najaf going to survive in a meaningful manner, right? Because the other figures who were in Najaf were relatively minor in comparison. And all the other major figures who were followed, who were Maraja, were mainly in Iran and other places. So if Najaf's preeminence was going to survive, how would it happen? And of course, then politics, of course, plays a role in this as well. There are those who would rather keep things independent of the Iranian state and the political theology of Iran. So they wanted to find a figure who could keep that, who would be outside of Iran, who would be independent of Iran, but who could potentially build up a very significant global following, who had the right credentials, who had the right support. He came from Sayyid Khoi's circle. He famously led the funeral prayers of Sayyid Khoi, one of the very few people who had an ijazah of ijtihad from Sayyid Khoi. And so there was a period of about 3 or 4 years for his manual of fatwas to be published and then significantly translated as well. Because what starts to emerge in the 90s, especially after, and 90s also because of the growth of communities outside of the traditional heartlands, and for example of those who went as refugees either from Iraq or from Afghanistan and other places, coming to places like England, going to America, Canada and so forth. So there was a growth of those communities and then the requirement for materials in English. And so in many ways I think the translation of Sayyid Sistani's manual in English is a very important event. In many ways, that really marks the beginning of his marja'iyah as a global phenomenon. And a key, of course, event in that was 2003, was the fall of Saddam, the change of government, in a sense, a sense of liberation and possibility for the Shia in Iraq, and an opening up of freedoms within somewhere like Najaf. And since then, I think that the rise of Sayyid Sistani's prestige has been even greater. This is someone who thinks religion should be guiding and advising, but is not insisting on ruling. And I think for all of those reasons, the development of Sayyid Sistani's authority since 2003 has been very significant.
When he assumes the helm, the first 10 years are not exactly the easiest. There was even a major assassination attempt on his life in 1998, which many do not mention. His employee was killed. Some said, leave Iraq, go and settle elsewhere. You will live in peace. He wanted to remain firm. Najaf had to be protected. The downfall of Saddam saw Ayatollah Sistani now in the spotlight more than he had ever been before. Now people could come and visit him. People could come and sit with him. People could come and see his worldview. But the turmoil of Iraq post-2003 allowed us to see Ayatollah Sistani in a new light. There is no doubt that what Ayatollah Sistani achieved post-2003 is monumental in the eyes of many, Muslims and non-Muslims alike. On the 4th of March 2014, the Daily Telegraph commentator, Colin Freeman, published an article naming Ayatollah Sistani as the most appropriate Nobel Peace Prize candidate. He also reported that he had been nominated earlier in 2006 by a group of Iraqi Christians. Friedman continued to say that Ayatollah Sistani has been an outstanding voice of moderation, peace, and tolerance, without whom the country would probably be a far bloodier place than it already is. He states, to get an idea of this, you have to go back to just after the invasion, when the ex-Ba'athists of Iraq formed an unholy alliance with certain non-Shia extreme groups. While killing Americans was one of their priorities, their other real passion was killing Shia, whom they viewed, as he states, not just as US collaborators, but as apostates too. In the decades since, Friedman states that the Shia community has suffered the most appalling provocation. Most of the car bombs that have gone off in Baghdad over the years have been targeted at Shia neighborhoods, killing thousands. Death squads regularly ambush Shia pilgrims as they head to Sistani's city of Najaf, turning the annual holy festivals into a ritual slaughter. In 2006, Friedman states that Al-Qaeda also bombed the Shia holy shrine at Samarra, an act roughly the equivalent to destroying St. Peter's Basilica. Yet throughout all this bloodshed, Ayatollah Sistani has beseeched ordinary Shias not to retaliate. Friedman's astounded by this. No, he has not been entirely successful, according to him. But in the year that followed the shrine attack, a low-level Sunni Shia civil war seemingly breaks out, with tens of thousands dying in it, tit-for-tat violence. But as with so many things in Iraq, Friedman concludes the horrors that actually took place were nothing compared to how bad it could have been were it not for Ayatollah Sistani. Ayatollah Sistani, Friedman states, has helped avert an all-out disaster and is credited as such not just by those who imitate him, but by many Western diplomats. Lady Luck has shined on us by keeping alive this Ayatollah, who resides in a small house in a narrow alley in Najaf and almost never goes out the door. How someone with his instincts and wisdom could have emerged from the train wreck that was Saddam Hussein's Iraq, he says, I will never know. All I have to say is, may he live to be 120 and give that man a Nobel Prize.
The terms Ayatollah and Fatwa were most closely associated at a certain period with the Salman Rushdie affair. In 2014, they were most closely associated with the fatwa issued by Ayatollah Sistani for the people of Iraq to rise and defend themselves against ISIS and the threat of ISIS and the violence of ISIS and the discrimination of ISIS. Can you tell us more about that particular fatwa and the ramifications of the statements that were made?
It was addressed to all Iraqis. And it came from a position of recognition that he had the authority to speak to all Iraqis. Now, it's not as if he hadn't done that before. You know, he'd spoken openly on the constitution. He'd spoken openly on the need for there to be accountable government. And, you know, with all the different levels of corruption, etc., that were going on in Iraq, at many times he'd intervened and said, look, the government needs to be accountable to the people. And if people are demonstrating against it, all well and good, right? Let them do that. Let their voices be heard. Let their demands be met. In 2014, there was, in many ways, it's sometimes quite difficult for people outside Iraq just to recognize what a great existential threat there was. You know, we've seen what had been happening in Syria, and there was a point at which, you know, ISIS potentially could have been controlling the whole of that region, you know, from the Syrian desert all the way down to the south of Iraq. And that would have been, basically would have meant the end of Iraq, but it would have caused a huge problem for the whole region. And that's why it required intervention. And that's precisely the sort of existential threat which requires the scholarly leadership to step up and to say something. And so it was in many ways the greatest way of mobilizing people. And everyone who's written and spoken about the fatwa or the bayan or the call to arms, even if you could call it that, in 2014 has said that it was a real pivotal moment.
On this very street, March 2021, the Pope met the Ayatollah. While many may know of the Pope, very few know of the Ayatollah. Ayatollah Sistani is one of the most influential personalities in the Muslim world today. But what is the basis of this influence? And why is he seen as one of the most important voices, not only in the Middle East, but throughout the world?
أؤمن بأن اللقاء الذي جمع بابا الفاتيكان بسماحة السيد كان له آثار كبيرة. طلب من السيد السيستاني يعني على أثر اللقاء الوفد الذي أرسل من قبل البابا أمور، ولكن السيد لم يستجب لواحدة منها أنه في ضمن البرامج أن يأتي البابا بكرسيه البابوي يجلس عليها، والسيد جالس هناك على كرسي آخر، فالسيد لم يقبل، قال هذه المصبات الموجودة عندنا ما الذي ينقصها؟ فنرجو أن فالوفد البابوي قبل هذا الكلام، ومن ثم طلب من السيد أمور أخرى. قال السيد بأنه مجيء البابا إلى هذا المكان مشروط بأن يقلع عليه، وهذا جدا صعب، لأنه الأمراء والرؤساء وكبار الشخصيات لا يمكن أن يأتون مع أحذيتهم ويصلون للغرفة التي يستقبل فيها. فنازع حذاءه ودخل على السيد. هذه الحالة الثانية التي كان لها تأثير. وأمور أخرى لست بصدد ذكرها، ولكنه عندما رجع وفي الطائرة أعلن بأنه نحن نعلم بأن البابا هو أكثر رجال الدين في العالم تبعية، يعني أكثر من مليار إنسان يتبعهم في الكاثوليك. عندما يقول كنت أشعر بأن هناك نقص في المعنويات التي عندي، وذهبت عند السيد رأيته رجلا عالما، رجلا فهيما، واستزدت من معنوياته. هذا المهم، لأن هذا الذي هو الرجل الأول في عالم المعنويات يقول ذهبت إلى السيد السيستاني فاستزدت من معنويات السيد، وذكر أمور كثيرة. ولكن المؤسف عندنا في محيطنا لم تذكر تلك الأحداث بالطريقة التي نقلت. السبب نحن المقصرون أو الإعلام لا يحل له ذلك؟ وعلى ضوء هذا، بأنه سمعت عن الكثير من الكاردينالية ورؤساء الجمهور وغيرهم بعد ذهاب البابا يتمنون الذهاب إلى النجف واللقاء بسماحة السيد السيستاني، وآخرهم كان ماكرون. ولكن السيد لظروفه الطارئة أيام كورونا لم يستجب لهذا الطلب. على أي حال يجب احنا أن نستغل هذه الظروف لخدمة الطائفة والمذهب.
Father, March 2021, the Pope comes to Najaf to visit Ayatollah Al-Sistani. Tell us more.
Well, the Pope's trip to Iraq has a number of facets to it. Firstly, primarily, in a sense, he's going to visit the Iraqi people as a whole, both Christian and Muslim, but with a special emphasis, obviously, on the Christian communities of whom he is the shepherd. But to the country as a whole, which has come through so much trauma, so much violence, he is going, as he himself said, as a pilgrim, not as a head of state, to be with people and to share something of their sufferings and their sorrows. That's the first level or facet. Added to that, he is going to go to cities like Mosul, which have a special significance. He's going to attempt to trace some of the footsteps of Abraham. And he's going to go to Najaf. And there in Najaf, you have these three distinct but interweaving institutions. You have the Hawza, and resting on the Hawza, the spirit of Atusi. You have the presence of Grand Ayatollah Sistani, and you have the tomb of Ali. And those three, for want of a better word, institutions are the things that make Najaf Najaf, so that when the Pope goes to Najaf, he is going to those three things. Even if he doesn't physically go to the tomb of Ali, even if he doesn't necessarily go to visit the Hawza itself, he is coming to the city which is inseparable from those three things. So it's a multi-level visit, not as a politician or a head of state, but as a religious pilgrim and a man of faith going to visit people of faith, and in particular a very important man of faith who is known in the world and has a popular following.
Would you argue that the Pope was surprised at the humble surroundings of Ayatollah Sistani? Maybe in contrast to the Vatican and what we've always seen of the Vatican from the outside, and then he visits Ayatollah Sistani. What do you think his reaction was when he saw this?
We know that the Pope coming back on the plane spoke at length to journalists and said a number of things. Now, this is quite an important issue because there was a moment in social media when the Pope and Sistani would be compared as the one lives in a palace and the one lives in a humble situation. And that's not really an accurate reflection, because the difference between them is the Pope is also a head of state. And he lives in the situation that any head of state lives in. In fact, the Pope lives in a smaller space in Rome than I do. I've got a larger set of rooms than he has. He shares a hotel with a large group of people. Notwithstanding that, there is no doubt that the humility, the surroundings in which the Ayatollah lives, considering who he is, his status, his wisdom, his life of prayer and faith, are extraordinary for most of us. To see a man of such status living in such a condition of humility and simplicity cannot but impress. The Pope himself remarked on this and said, I have met a man of faith, a man of humility, and a man of God.
Why now? Why the meeting in 2021? From the perspective of the Pope in particular, why do you think he felt it was high time that he met the grand jurists in the Shia world? And could this possibly be the springboard for future Shia Catholic dialogue?
I would say that there are probably two reasons why the Pope went to Iraq right now. Firstly, he was attempting to enclose in his embrace the whole Islamic world. 2 years ago, he met with the Sheikh of Al-Azhar. They signed a document together about human fraternity. And in a sense, he was meeting in that one person with the whole Sunni world. This was his chance to show that he understands that Islam is a bigger world than that, and that he needed to embrace the whole Islamic family. So that was the first thing. This was the closing of the embrace by the Pope, who is embracing the Islamic world as a brother in faith. And we know about that concept that we hear from Ali, for example, about a brother in faith. But there's a second element, and that is that the Iraqis have been treated like dirt by so many nations. The Pope is saying to them, you are an important part of the world community, and you are no less important than any other country. And I'm coming to you because I need you to know that I am with you in this. I may not be able to lift your sufferings or stop them or intervene politically, but I need you to know that my presence here is to tell you how important you are compared to what other narratives may be saying. So it's a double reason for that. He meets, of course, with Al-Sistani because he understands, and he's been prepped quite clearly, that who he is and how many people follow him. Millions of people throughout the world listen to him, are taught by him, take faith from him. So he understands quite clearly that this is the man to meet. Even if he may not be able to have as great an influence as the Pope might hope, that's not the issue. The issue is two men of faith meeting is in itself a symbolic gesture for the world of two men with different worldviews, but who are reading from the same page when it comes to peace, when it comes to justice, when it comes to religious freedom. And I think that's very important.
Do you think many people knew that when ISIS had executed some members of the Christian community in Mosul, had destroyed some churches in Mosul, do you think many people knew that Ayatollah Sistani was one of the first to say you protect any Iraqi, irrespective of their religious background?
Absolutely not, because the narratives around ISIS were the narratives that Western media decided to pursue. And they were almost all of them wrong and one-sided and biased, and they were not willing at any stage to recognize who exactly was combating ISIS. Who was it who was going in? Who were giving their lives against the ISIS forces? It was not a popular narrative with the Western media, and therefore they ignored it. The real issue for me, the problem with Al-Sistani is that he is seen by some in the West as the good Muslim. He's the one we can talk to. And that diminishes his holiness, his learning, his wisdom. He's not just the good Muslim, and he's not a pawn in anybody's game. And I hope that the one thing this visit may have done was to open the eyes of people that there's a great deal more to Al-Sistani than just, the Americans hoping that he'll be their friend, that he is genuinely a peacemaker, that he genuinely has stepped in and built bridges between people in very short spaces of time, in moments of great emergency, that he's genuinely spoken for the Christian and other minorities, not just as a as a soundbite, but because he truly, authentically believes that this is the right thing to do. And it would be good to see the media printing that narrative, not just the popular narrative, which is that Islam is a problem.
This is one of the most remarkable achievements in terms of philanthropy in the life of Ayatollah Al-Uzma, السيد Ali Al-Sistani. Behind me is the Noor Hospital, arguably what is to be the largest hospital in Qom. Part of the social philanthropic vision of Ayatollah Al-Sistani is that people are helped in all walks of life, not only in Islamic education, but are also helped relating to their medical concerns. And under the guidance of his representative, Hujjat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, Sayyid Jawad al-Shahristani, as well as under the supervision of Sayyid Ala Najaf over here in Qom, you see this outstanding endeavor. An endeavor that will look after the lives of so many. Behind me we've seen what is going to be the building of a ward whose speciality is going to be the care for those who are suffering from cancer, for those who have heart issues, for those who have kidney issues, for those who may have difficulties and trials with the health of their children. Everybody within the vicinity of this area will be helped. And you find in this holy city of Qom, which was so much associated with learning, is also associated with his vision of philanthropy, of help for the orphans, for the needy, for the poor, and for the widows. Ayatollah Sistani moves here from Mashhad, and you find that not only does he study here, but he ends up leaving a legacy behind, and a legacy that will continue to serve generation after generation. Behind me over here, you'll witness the foundation of what's going to be one of the most important research centers in the Shia world. With the upheavals that Ayatollah Sistani had seen in his life, with the sectarian strife that he witnessed, he wanted a specialized place where people of all different walks of life, different denominations, different sects, were able to come and were able to study and explore the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family. And therefore you found that this was one of the main areas which he wanted fulfilled. His representative, Sayyid Jawad Shahristani, sought to ensure that this vision was complete. Therefore you found that the representatives of Ayatollah Sistani, one of their main roles was to identify the needs of their local area, the needs of their local community. And this place here will be a research hub for many in the world, where they're able to come, even take a sabbatical, and be able to come out with groundbreaking analysis of different areas and segments of the religion of Islam. Ayatollah Sistani's legacy will live forever. A man who saw so many trials and tribulations, political upheavals and revolutions, and never did it once affect his character. Indeed, there is hope for humanity when a person examines the biography of Ayatollah Sistani. When the flames of sectarianism were lit by ISIS, he remained calm, remained wise, and remained the absolute embodiment of the prophetic role model that we all expected to see in him. At the same time, he sought a world where people could live either as brothers in faith or equals in humanity. Look around me today, Muslims of different denominations and sects walk around the very man he sought to embody. Imam Ali, peace be upon him. But at the same time, the meeting with the Pope highlights that even what some espoused as being the clash of civilizations between Islam and the West may not be true. We can live together in peace, we can live together in harmony, and we can live together in dialogue. With a figure like Ayatollah Al-Sistani, we can always have an example of how to ensure that human beings can look for each other's compassion, empathy, and unity of love. God bless Ayatollah Al-Sistani.
He is an extraordinary human being.
One of Iraq's most powerful figures in Shia Islam.
Who is the Grand Ayatollah?
He prefers to stay out of the public eye.
Why is Pope Francis meeting him?
He's a reclusive leader who is rarely seen in public.
His position was key in the Islamic State's downfall.